Good morning, everyone. I understand that the webinar is now live, so I'd like to say a good morning to everyone that's joined us this morning. And I'd like to give a really warm welcome this morning to Tony Juniper, who's the chair of Natural England, and to Geoff Sansome, who is head of agricultural policy at Natural England as well. So, gentlemen, a very warm welcome to both of you. Also extend no less a warm welcome, but a welcome to Dan Phipps and Thomas Carrick, who are joining us on the panel this morning. Many of you in the audience may know Dan. Dan is the recently elected chair of NSA and also chair of our Eastern region, and Thomas is the chair of our Northern region. So we'll do a couple of introductions in a moment, but let's start with you, Tony. Tony, a lot of people will know you from your role as chair of Natural England, but we also know from social media that you've got your own independent views on life, and you've also had a life before joining Natural England. So yes, if you will, just spend a moment or two giving us a bit of an insight to yourself. Would you mind doing that?
No, of course, Phil. Good morning, everybody. My name is Tony Juniper. As Phil says, I'm very pleased to be the chairman of Natural England. I had a long involvement with environmental and sustainability questions going back over many years before joining Natural England, including a spell working with BirdLife International, working on rare parrots, would you believe? A spell at Friends of the Earth, actually quite a long time there, 18 years, working on tropical rainforests, various aspects of sustainable agriculture, transport policy and climate change, ultimately, when I was director there. Then spent quite a few years being an independent advisor and writer, and I worked for Prince Charles. I helped him a lot with various of his projects, including his wool initiative, funnily enough, and then spent a bit of time working with companies in that same period, so for various multinationals who needed to get a little bit greener, hopefully much greener actually. I wrote some books. Then I went to WWF for a period and worked there as the campaigns director, at the same time as being president of the Wildlife Trust, which was a fantastic honour. And then 2 years ago came to Natural England, where I am now.
Great. Well, thank you very much. There's certainly some stuff there that I've learned this morning, and I'm sure a lot of other people have too. So, yeah, thank you very much, Tony. And Geoff, if you could just introduce yourself. You're head of agricultural policy at Natural England, but just tell us a bit about you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Phil. Morning, everyone. Yeah, equally long career as Tony, but I haven't written as many books. Originally a graduate of North Wales in Bangor. I mentioned that because of the clear sheep connections. Then 20 years with ADAS as an advisor in various parts of the country, very, very technically focused. And many of those years actually working overseas in helping in the production of farm advisory services. Moved to the Rural Development Service in 2001, where I was managing not only agri-environment, but the socio-economic schemes. And of course, that moved into Natural England in 2006, where I'm now head of agriculture. I'm speaking to you from the family farm in Worcestershire, beef, arable and higher tier stewardship show. I know what it's like to be a customer, as well as part of the delivery solution for that.
Thanks very much, Geoff. No sheep, beef and arable, no sheep.
Yes, I've got 100 sheep on some forage rape and stubble turnips as we speak. So.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Dan, just coming to you, Dan. Just for those people that don't know, just introduce yourself very briefly, if you could.
Yeah. Good morning, everybody. So my name's Dan Phipps. I farm in East Anglia. I was brought up on a farm in West Sussex. And basically, since coming away from there, wherever I've farmed is always something else that can't be farmed otherwise. So a heathland, a hill, a wet area. And then otherwise, we're involved in grass that needs managing and improving. So yeah, and the other thing, of course, is scavenging. We're always clearing up a crop of something, cabbages, or there's those sort of opportunities. So we always sort of feel that we're farming around everybody.
Great. Yeah. Thank you, Dan. And Tom Carrick.
Good morning, everybody. My name's Thomas Carrick. If you don't already know, I'm a predominantly sheep farmer from the North Pennines, Alston in Cumbria, and we are predominantly hill, with a decent part of that being moorland. And we have been involved one way or another with stewardship for 20 to 30 years now. So we have a bit of a history with this kind of thing, and a little bit of knowledge about what works and a little bit of knowledge about what doesn't. And I look forward to the debate going forward and hearing what these two gentlemen have to say.
Great. Okay. Thanks very much, everyone. So what we're going to do is to have a discussion amongst ourselves, and then we've got a very large number of questions that have come in. They do fall under several common categories, so I'll try and group them together when we come to questions. And Geoff has very kindly offered to take lots of questions offline afterwards as well. But let me just start by setting the scene, really. And I'm going to come to you, Tony, and you know, we all know that we, as the rest of the world, really is facing a huge amount of change, I guess, you know, and I think, you know, that message is getting through and people are prepared to have to change in the future. But I think we've seen on many occasions that, you know, sometimes change for change's sake is not always a good thing. And there is a danger that we disregard or throw away things that we've got today that we don't necessarily value, and of course you don't know that you've lost them until it's too late and they've gone, really. And we within the NSA, it wouldn't surprise you, but within the NSA we generally think that sheep farming is good. We have in excess of 45,000 sheep farmers here in this country. Most of those sheep farms are highly individual, small family businesses. We're still mainly, increasingly actually, seeing new entrants come into our sector. And from a cultural and a community and a rural economy perspective, I believe that we're really, really rich. We have over 80 sheep breed societies with huge breed diversity and an incredible diversity in farming and approach as well. In the uplands in particular, sheep farming is a big part of rural economies and communities. It creates a countryside that people flock to, and most of the big tourist areas in this country are often underpinned by sheep farming. I would argue that it has an almost symbiotic relationship with farmland and grassland wildlife, and produces in doing that, it produces one of the most sustainable sources of meat and fibre available to us. In the lower ground, it's the reason why much of our permanent pasture remains. And increasingly on arable farms now, we're starting to see the reintroduction of grass and forage crops with sheep in order to build soil and soil organic matter, to break up cropping rotations and a return to mixed farming, something that is good for nature and most environmental organisations would say is good. There's growing evidence that when you look at sheep farming on a whole life cycle level, sheep farming is nowhere near as bad for climate change as has been painted over the last decade or so. The buzzword today is all about restorative or regenerative farming, but apart from a blip in the late 70s and 1980s, where policies drove things in the wrong direction, I would argue again that most sheep farming has always been regenerative in nature. So what I'd say to you, what is there not to like, really? What is there not to like about what we're doing? And through this process of change, how do we make sure that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, if you like? Could you just give us your views on some of what I've said, really, and your view of countryside and land management and sheep farming?
Yeah, very good, Phil. Thank you. So thank you for that introduction, much of which I can agree with. I just thought I'd kick off with a few remarks about Natural England, just because many of your members and people in your network may not see the full breadth of what we do. And it's important, I think, just to get the context of then how we appear on the ground when we're working with people who are actually managing land. So you'll know, I'm sure everyone will know, that Natural England is the government's official nature conservation agency in England. We were formed under an Act of Parliament in 2006, but we've got ancestor organisations going all the way back to 1949. And our remit over that period, and today it's in the law, it says our purpose is to conserve and enhance the natural environment. So that's the easy bit, and then you start looking at what we actually have to do, and there's quite a lot of different roles we play. So one is to be the government's advisor on conservation issues. So for example, we will speak to officials and ministers about things like ELM, the new agricultural policy, and help them to get that right by bringing expert advice from people who've been working on the ground to hopefully hone that into a good place. We're also a regulatory agency, so we notify sites of special scientific interest and operate the legal regime around that. And of course, we are also the Wildlife Management Authority, and many of your members will have seen that flurry of interest a couple of years ago around general licenses and some of the rules operated there. obviously an issue for many sheep farmers. We're also a delivery body, so when the government decides what its policy will be, we help it to actually occur on the ground, and that's where a lot of interaction between us and your members occurs through the operation of agri-environment schemes, HLS, countryside stewardship, and so on. And then we're also a scientific body, so in order to do all of the above, we need to know what we're talking about, so we gather and manage data, and we maintain a body of experts who are able to advise and decide on complex questions of ecology. And then the final kind of big category is being a convener. And, you know, that's about bringing people together at the scale of landscapes. And so, you know, farm clusters and doing what we can to help facilitate the emergence of those, bringing together developers, local authorities and NGOs to do nature recovery projects and those kinds of things. So it's pretty broad and wide. And, you know, the regime that we work in, it's evolved over 70 odd years. And today there are, I'm right in saying, I'm sure, and in fact, I'm probably being a bit low on the estimate, more than 400 powers and duties that are in different acts of parliament that we operate on behalf of government, which makes this a very complicated space to work in. And, you know, that was never a situation that has stood still. And today, as you say, Phil, there's massive change underway, and it's being driven through this growing realization that we do have literally two massive ecological emergencies unfolding across the entire world, one related to climate change and the other one related to the decline of nature. And these two things are fundamentally connected to one another. And what is now going on is an attempt by governments, including our own, to try and come forward with a set of policies and actions that can deal with that and meet it in a way which is going to sustain the future of the economy and everything else. And so what are those big policy areas? Well, things that will be very evident, well, they already are, but in the coming years. One is the 25-year environment plan. This is the first time we've had a big government policy that says, you know, the aim now is to recover and restore the environment, not just to simply slow down its decline, which is pretty much what was going on for decades before. We have behind that, obviously, the new ELM, the Environmental Land Management Policy, which is seeking to switch the old subsidy regime into payments for environmental services. Huge complexity there, and I'm sure we'll get into some of that as we go along in terms of what this means from the point of view of those legacy schemes like HLS and countryside stewardship and where we go in the future. So that's a big one. We've got huge ambition on tree and woodland establishment, so 30,000 hectares a year. Those trees have got to go somewhere, and obviously in a country like ours where we've got 55 million people in England with demand for housing, for food production, for water supply, energy, infrastructure, places for people to go outside and you know, enjoy the outdoors, that's an incredible set of pressures. And so, you know, this is really quite a complex jigsaw to put together. And so then we have on top of that new policies coming with the so-called net gain. So this is a new law that will come when the Environment Bill is passed that will require developers of houses to recreate natural habitats above and beyond what was lost when the houses were built. And this will in turn generate a market amongst land managers who can be providing those environmental benefits in ways which create that net gain. And so there's other stuff as well, but behind all of that, the big thing for us at Natural England is this idea of establishing a national nature recovery network, because the truth is, if you look at all the data that's been gathered over the years, our wildlife and our natural habitats in this country have gone below a level that is ideal for all the things that we need to get from those natural areas. And so at the moment, you know, it's not only a question of squaring off all those land uses and sustaining farming. You know, the policy now recognises that the land also needs to be harnessed to catch carbon. The land ideally would be managed to improve the river water quality. The land would be managed ideally to reduce flood risk. It would be ideally in the future more beautiful as a result of the way in which we do that nature recovery network, and ideally would be facilitating public access so that people can enjoy the benefits of being outside. And on top of all of that, of course, which brings us back to our core purpose, is to protect the wildlife and to restore wildlife populations. So that's the big picture. As you say, you know, it's fast moving, it's huge, there's big tectonic plates grinding away, but for good reason, considering what we now know about the state of play in the world, and you know, the effect of human activities over many years now and what that's leading to. So then the question is, from the point of view of your organization, Phil, is you know, where do sheep fit into all of that? And to coin a kind of ugly and clumsy soundbite, I think it's about the right kinds of sheep in the right place, you know, for the right reasons. And you know, what right would mean, obviously, is you know, a matter of perspective. And so from the point of view of farmers, obviously right means, you know, being able to make a business work and to be able to make the numbers add up. From an ecologist point of view, it might mean we want the wildflowers back and we want more carbon in the soil. And so this is then where we get into a really complicated process of trying to square off those different interests to get the best outcome for society, recognizing that background of, you know, many laws going back over many years, and you know, the emerging policy. And that's something that requires a lot of engagement, a lot of discussion, and that's what's going on with DEFRA at the moment in that particular arena of where environment meets agriculture, is to try and get that ELM policy right, learning from the past, trying to anticipate some of the drivers in the future to create something that hopefully will be able to you know, accommodate these different interests. But the thing I would say is that, well, I sincerely hope, and I think it's happening, that we're now moving beyond this rather unhelpful discussion that's been there for years, where, you know, it was either food or nature. You know, it's either agriculture or wildlife. And, you know, I think we're moving into a new phase now where most people can see that what we have to do is both, because we can't have a country that doesn't produce food, but on the other side, we've got to do our bit to restore all of those critical environmental services which are important for society. And then the question comes, you know, how do we do that with the tools we've got available, working with different sectors, including the sheep sector, to be able to make that occur. So, you know, the good thing, however, is that we've got many good examples of what's possible, and so around here, so I may have met Dan sheep, I don't know, but around here, you know, a lot of conservation grazing goes on in the fragments of decent grassland we've got left. You know, we have sheep being used to maintain the biological interest of those places, and you know, in different parts of the country, in the uplands last winter, I met farmers in North Yorkshire who were adjusting their sheep business to bring back waders, and they were doing it in ways that seemed to be making business sense to them as well. They were switching the breed to be more hardy animals that required less veterinary care and feeding in winter, and therefore you know, could be reared more cost effectively and could be done at lower density. And as a result of that, things like woodcock and golden plover were coming back onto the hillside, not been seen there for years. And that was a fantastic success story with a bit of diversification going on as well. That particular farmer was breeding some rare ponies too, which were going off to the US, but it was all part of the integrated use of that land. So, you know, we do have those good examples, and hopefully what they can do is start to inspire more of you know, that at scale as we go forward, using these new policy tools, recognizing at the same time, however, that there are some big pieces that are shifting in this whole discussion, which are beyond any of our control, really. So one is this, you know, the vegan kind of theme that's broken out, and, you know, people wanting to, you know, avoid meat for environmental reasons. And, you know, that discussion, it's often spurious in terms of, you know, the conclusions that people reach, but nonetheless they do reach them, and it puts a bit of complexity into the discussion. The response to that, I would say, probably is about, you know, better meat that is delivering all of those environmental benefits, and finding ways of getting that into the market in a way that people can recognize that, you know, there is actually a biodiversity and a carbon benefit from certain kinds of meat that's very different from other kinds of meat. And actually, going back to your point earlier about the sustainability of British sheep, you know, there's a big difference between the environmental credentials of a sheep coming off of sustainable grassland in England compared with a cow that's being fed on soya beans that came from where the Amazon has been burnt down. And, you know, they're both meat, but they're very, very different in terms of their credentials. And so there's a challenge there to work into that space where people are raising concerns about livestock agriculture, but to come with an offer that is, you know, able to cut through and say, actually, no, this is not that, this is something different. So there's a piece there as well. The carbon piece I mentioned a couple of times, you know, and it's linked to that livestock agriculture piece. We need to do some more work. We actually will publish something next month, I believe, looking at carbon in ecosystems that are not woodlands or peatlands. So a lot of carbon can be locked up in pasture, but what do we know about that, and how can we maximize that as part of this, hopefully, shift back towards mixed farming across England, which, as you say, brings many benefits for soil, could be for carbon, certainly for biodiversity, and the overall sustainability of agriculture. Organic systems, obviously, you know, you can't do them without animals. And so, you know, how do we blend that piece into the future of farming, recognizing those carbon and other dimensions that are now there. And then another big piece which is moving, which obviously is affecting your world, is this big call for rewilding. And what does that mean? And you know, maybe we'll discuss some of that in the conversation, Phil. And but you know, it's just another dimension that's been put there as a result of the way the debate is going. But you know, so you know, to answer your question, you know, where do we see sheep, and what do we think of that? Well, it can be very good, and it can have downsides. And our job is to help achieve the sweet spot where we get food production, rural communities, economic benefit for communities, at the same time as achieving environmental goals. And that's the aim at Natural England.
Great. Okay. Thanks very much, Tony. I'm going to bring Dan in now, if I could. But Tony, you just touched very much on that interplay between well, delivery of public goods, environmental outcomes, and the need for farmers to be productive. And again, those are the two big challenges that the government has set our industry to be more productive and to enhance or maintain and further enhance the countryside. And that balance, I guess, will be different on different farms all the way across the country, and that does relate as well to our trade and our markets as well. You know, part of our productivity is gained, you know, if it's successful, is achieved by having good, strong markets. So Dan, do you just want to talk a little bit about what you see over in East Anglia, and again that balance between environmental and productivity, and the land sharing, land sparing approach as well?
Yeah, so I mean, I just want to start because I've sort of made all sorts of notes there, really. But I think as a farmer, you do feel a sort of sense of guilt almost that there's what we've been driven to do over sort of recent years in terms of production and to produce cheaply in order to feed people. There's a sort of pressure on you, and I think as farmers generally, people are trying to do what they can to fit it in, but of course ultimately they've got businesses to run. And they're feeling that pressure. And the other thing then that sort of troubles me within that is that, are we going to get the right support, not necessarily your remit here, Tony, but from the government, to make sure we're just not pushing this food production to other parts of the world? Is that right for us to do that?
Yeah.
Ultimately, whatever we do with these schemes, they've got to be done in such a way that it incentivizes people to work with you and get that balance as right as we possibly can.
Yeah,
a lot of farmers are naturally trying to do that within their own farms, but they want financial support where it's available to really make it work, I feel.
Sure.
Thanks, Dan. And Thomas, from a northern region and an uplands perspective, again, you know, it's, if anything, maybe the challenges are even greater, aren't they? Because of the expectations on some of our uplands and our commons for access and for wildlife and for water and carbon, all those sorts of things. So just come in with a few, you know, what are you thinking at the moment? Come in with a few of your comments.
Yeah, so I think you outlined a few of the reasons why the uplands has been tied into stewardship for so long, 4 decades now, and many of us, certainly in the area where I live, have been part of stewardship schemes for 1, 2, 3 decades now. I think if you looked at the opinion of farmers in these areas, they would already say they were doing something that was very positive for the environment, and areas that were highlighted as needing improvement 20 years ago have been improved, if you see what I mean. And I suppose the big worry that people have when they're looking at potentially really tight rules going forward in elms is that, you know, the guys who have made really good environmental strides over the last 20 years, or who perhaps have always had a really good base of biodiversity on their farm, are they going to be made to tighten their sheep farming enterprises to a level which would make them potentially unviable going forwards, or would they be encouraged to keep doing what they're already doing?
Yeah.
Tony, do you want to come back on either Dan or Thomas's points?
Yeah, so from what I've seen, Thomas, and I know the team who are speaking more closely with the DEFRA officials would echo that point about, you know, we want to reward good practice, and so we don't want to be discouraging people to be going backwards or anything else. From what I've seen, and, you know, it's partly about that, but also partly about the complexity of the rules and some of the ways in which they can work against people doing the right thing, is to start getting more of a focus on outcomes. And so if we can determine what good looks like in a particular landscape, we can be rewarding behavior that's leading to those outcomes. And actually we have been involved in a trial that's been going on for a few years on so-called payments by results, including in the Yorkshire Dales with people who are doing sheep up there. And I was just struck by the enthusiasm of the farmers for that one, in the sense of them effectively being given free rein to achieve a set of outcomes, whether that's, you know, good wader habitat or the diversity of the plants back on the pasture, and not having to operate against a very tightly written rule book, but to be offered, you know, the opportunity to deliver these outcomes and then to be rewarded for that. And so hopefully, you know, if we do go down that path with elm, that might help to diminish the chances of some of these unintended consequences coming through of people, you know, who've been doing good work being encouraged to go backwards. Geoff might have more, well, I'm sure Geoff will have a lot more to say about all of that. On some of your points, Dan, on that land sparing and land sharing discussion, I reached the conclusion a little while ago that actually that's not a particularly good way of looking at this, because, you know, it's both of those, but also it's about the entire food system and the extent to which, you know, we've got a good view of how we're going to feed people sustainably into the future, and to get beyond this assumption that we have to produce as much food as cheaply as possible. Of course, you know, sufficient food and it not being expensive are both very good things. But if we don't take that wider view of the sustainability of the system and look at things like food waste and, you know, the extent to which, you know, we're effectively putting land in the bin on quite a large scale in this country, then we kind of lose sight of the picture. So I think we just need to cast that a little bit more broadly. I mean, it's been a helpful dichotomy, that sparing, sharing thing, to provoke debate. But I don't necessarily believe it gives us too many answers. What I do strongly agree with is the need to make sure that when we begin to go on this journey towards more, well, we're already on it, as we go further on this journey towards sustainable agriculture in Britain, that we don't offshore a lot of our environmental impacts to somewhere else. Exactly the same thing's been going on with carbon, of course. You know, we shut our coal and steel industry, and then, you know, we're importing coal and steel from elsewhere. And if we do the same with food, it's not necessarily an answer. So we do need to make sure that, you know, we can get as much as we possibly can out of our own landscapes, but do that in ways where the nature's coming back and the carbon is going down. And that's the challenge. But this idea that we put loads of the country into a wild state and import our food, I don't think that really adds up to a solution.
So just go on, carry on, Thomas, go on.
I was just going to say that I really welcome much of what you're saying, you know, the appreciation for a really healthy food that is produced in a really extensive way, and the fact that sheep really can be part of nature-friendly, high welfare production system if it's done right. And from what I gather from what you're saying, you really are standing in a position where you're going to listen to what has worked in the past and what people on the ground are thinking is a sensible way to move forwards, rather than what we've historically seen as ideas pushed towards farmers which not necessarily have achieved a very good outcome. And it's really quite warming to hear that you're open to that sort of thinking.
Well, thanks, Thomas. It's a very practical thing from my point of view. I don't think it will work if we don't do that. If we don't have people engaged at the level of, you know, the practicalities and where things, you know, the rubber hits the road in terms of, you know, what happens on the land. And if the policy doesn't gear into that in an effective way, it's not going to get the results we want. And so, you know, this is why this next period on ELMS with the tests and trials and the piloting is going to be so crucial. I was speaking to an official the other day who, kind of just pointed out the tension. And I know amongst the farming communities, there's a lot of uncertainty and feeling we don't really know what's going on. But against that is this idea that actually what we're now trying to do is to trial this stuff and to do some level of co-creation. And so if we're going to do that, then evidently we don't know the answer yet, because we're still kind of, you know, trying to work through work in progress. But Geoff is much closer to that stuff and might be able to offer more informed reflections than my overview.
Geoff, would you like to come in? Before you do, could I just pick up on that point and expand that point a little bit? Because you know, that the word that you use there, Tony, co-creation, is something, is another bit like regenerative farming. It is a buzzword at the moment, and it's running through DEFRA, and we're engaged with a lot of co-creation with DEFRA and AHDB and others. That we're starting to see work now. It's a process that is working. We're seeing it with ELMS, that there's definitely a high level of co-creation, which is really important. But what I'm hearing very, very strongly on the ground is that the stuff that we're dealing with today, the renewal of stewardship agreements and HLS agreements, is not being done through a process of co-creation and co-design. And we've said on a number of occasions that we would almost like to see a moratorium on any significant changes to farm businesses through this process until ELMS, that co-creation process, is complete, really. But, you know, I bet 6 out of the 10 questions that I've received, or 60% of the questions I've received, would have touched on that issue about, you know, there is no engagement with farmers in the renewal of these agreements. There's no inclusion, and there's no recognition of some of the value that these guys are already delivering on their very traditional farms. But Geoff, I don't know if you...
Geoff might have a few remarks on that.
Well, some reflections. Firstly, I was struck by Dan's feeling of guilt, which I totally recognise, and I often find myself defending the farming industry as you know, not people to blame, but people who have responded superbly to the policy ask of the day, which, if you look at, you know, the policies of the last 50-60 years, we have done. Obviously, the immense challenge is there is a considerable policy shift now, and I'm sure in the long term, you know, farmers and land managers will respond superbly to that policy shift. But I also realise the enormous change within that. Just to pick up on some of Thomas's points first, I think that there is, you know, massive opportunity and ambition within ELM to move away from some of the situations we have, some of which are perverse, some of which have resulted from the constraints of, you know, EU requirements from the old schemes. So, you know, for example, some of the prescriptiveness of the existing schemes. There's huge ambition, as Tony mentions, in the future to put the responsibility of that, you know, down to the land manager who knows best to, you know, secure the outcome. There is the real live issue of the misbalance of payment for you know, habitat maintenance versus habitat creation, which does create some perverse incentives. And, you know, there's a perverse incentive at the moment in terms of you know, keeping permanent grassland down or not. And then there is some of the challenges around payment rate methodologies, which I'm sure we come on to. You know, we've been constrained not only from EU considerations, but, you know, WTO considerations down the income foregone payment calculation rates, which when you're dealing with an inherently I was going to say unprofitable, but not very profitable enterprise, such as, you know, upland or indeed lowland grazing livestock, it might replace the gross margin, but if it's a very low gross margin, it's not so attractive. And there still is a hope, and it's a live hope, that we can move not only to, you know, payment by results methodology, but also to a methodology that actually rewards natural capital, you know, concentrate on the value as opposed to the cost of these activities. So I think in all of that, there's a lot of opportunity looking forward. I guess where you were leading me, Phil, is what about the challenges of the day at the moment, and this is the issue of HLS extensions and transition to countryside stewardship. I think it's too much of a generalization to say that there's no engagement, or that, you know, in every event, should we say, you know, stocking rates are decreased, etc. I think we need to remember what the HLS, what higher tier is there to deliver. It's clearly there to you know, deliver environmental outcomes. I think there is a particular dynamic, particularly in the uplands, which is, you know, confused that. If we go back to 2005, when the hill farming allowance was then embedded into stewardship, into UELS, and indeed those payments, those enhanced payments, are still persisting along with the uplift in BPS in extended HLSs, if you're following all my acronyms. So there has been, shall we say, a slightly perverse financial incentive to extend HLS agreements as opposed to move them into higher tier. So yes, there are discussions which come into play around stocking rates. And these are purely based on if the objectives aren't being met. So many of these agreements are covering protected sites, which have very clear, you know, management objectives, and HLS agreements have indicators of success objectives. And if those objectives aren't being met, then we will, you know, in conjunction with the land managers, discuss not only decrease stocking rates. Down in Dartmoor, we're trying to encourage increased stocking rates and different mixes of cattle and sheep. And also countryside stewardship, higher tier, actually presents new opportunities for capital payments that you can't deliver by just continually renewing HLS agreements. So I wouldn't want to generalize, but I just had some stats handy. In Cumbria, over the last 3 years, we've renegotiated 24 big commons agreements. 7 of those have gone into higher tier. 15 of those have been extended in HLS, 9 of which had stocking rate adjustments. The others didn't, and then we're continuing to discuss the other 2. So we do have some issues there, but I wouldn't want to generalize that it's you know, some kind of conspiracy theory to take sheep off the hill, etc.
Okay, Tony,
yeah,
you're
sorry,
trying to come in.
Yeah, just the only thing I'd add is just in relation to this perceived, well, not very kind of strong engagement between Natural England and the farming community. And, you know, an element of that will be the fact that our organisation suffered really quite significant cuts in its capacity over a 10-year period, starting in about 2010, wasn't it, Geoff? And, you know, the organisation was shrunk back in a way that did mean we had a much depleted front line of people who can go out and talk to land managers. And so that will be one element in that perception and that feeling that, you know, it's harder to get hold of us and to be able to talk to a real person. I think we're actually turning a corner now, and I'm hoping that these new policies will lead to, you know, the organisation being able to have that capacity returned. But that is one element as well, just to put that into the mix.
We did say that we can't really get into specific site situations here, although Geoff, you've offered to pick some of these up afterwards. But if I just read out some of the comments that I've had from the Federation of Cumbria Commoners, who have been, where I know they've been working with common associations across all of England. It's evident that there are significant disparities about how Natural England staff are applying the rules and conditions for HLS extensions in different parts of the country. You've probably answered that one, Geoff, really. But Exmoor and on some Pennines Commons, commoners have been offered extensions with no changes, while in the Lake District and Dartmoor, commoners are being asked to agree to make significant reductions to stock numbers. In effect, commoners are being asked to deliver a substantially changed scheme for a 1-year period in the hope that it might be rolled over annually until Elms comes on stream. And the other point that they make is that for most commoners, this is the first time, i.e. the 9th year of a 10-year scheme, that they've been told that their scheme is not delivering.
I think we probably have covered all those points, Phil. I think the disparity issue is that we don't have a blanket we don't have a blanket approach to these. We will look at individual situations. So as I've said, higher tier, the move into higher tier creates opportunities for new capital payments. So, it might be scrub planting, tree planting, fencing, grip blocking that you cannot do with an HLS extension, and that has proved attractive to many agreement holders. Likewise, if there's no need to adjust stocking rates and no need for capital, then the continued HFA underpinned HLS payment rates is equally proved attractive. So it's right, there is disparity, but it's for some very good reasons. And I think Tony's touched on the challenges we've had with regard to what we would call our aftercare. That's become quite acute in the last, well, I guess it is really since 2011, as Tony said, when I think we took about 800, well, we had to take about 800 people out of the organization. So it has become challenging. I'd be very surprised if there'd been no interaction whatsoever, but gone are the days when we could visit every agreement holder every year, which in previous times, in my former life in Rural Development Service, when we were dealing with about 10,000 agreements across the country, that's what we did. And obviously there's a challenge going forward with regard to ELM, where the ambition is for 90,000 agreements. So, things will have to be done pretty differently, but we will certainly focus our effort on those sites which are most precious to us and to the nation, and where we see the greatest reward as well.
There's a couple of comments here as well about the calculation of wild deer within stocking levels on commons. So in some areas it seems that there is an assessment being done on wild deer numbers, and that is affecting grazing levels for sheep, and those farmers quite rightly say the control of those deer is completely out of my hands. I'm a rights holder on a common. I have nothing to do with them at all. What can be done about that? A sheep being replaced by deer, and
well, might be a good time to talk about lynx then.
Well, let's come on to that in a moment, because I don't think that's going to be the entire solution somehow. But and just a very specific question in relating to that too. There has been a question raised repeatedly to me about the North Country hill cheviot. And the fact that the cheviot is counted as a bigger breed, and the stocking reductions are stronger or greater on the hill cheviot sheep, and there is some confusion maybe between the hill cheviot and the park cheviot sheep, that are two completely different animals. Now that may be a very specific issue we want to pick up later on. I don't know.
Yeah, it's an issue I'm aware of, and it's an issue I'm slightly uncomfortable with, to be honest, in some circumstances. But it's perhaps a specific issue we could come back to outside of this, Phil.
Let's talk about links, shall we? You introduced this, Geoff, but let's talk about links and I suppose species introductions, reintroductions generally, because we with a lot of farmers up in the north of England. Fought very publicly against the plans to release links up in Kielder back in 2018, and it does seem now that just 2 years later, after recommendations that a license shouldn't be granted, that not only is an application being made, but also very positive noises seem to be made. And I know, Tony, you're in a difficult situation in being the chair of Natural England, but also clearly with very personal views. But you know, my worry about this is that we've got a whole army of farmers up in the north of England, around Kielder, that are bought into agri-environment schemes. They're doing an awful lot for wildlife and the environment. They're prepared to do more. But if I was in their shoes, I would be very cautious about planting trees now and planting more habitat if I thought that 5 years down the line I was going to get lynx lying up, potentially damaging my sheep. You know, I think there's a huge risk to this project, and I don't think the country is suitable for a release of such an apex predator. But let's have a discussion.
Yeah. So so the government's 25-year environment plan, which is like the core policy document which sets out this ambition for nature recovery, it does have an element of restoring lost species and improving the populations of those that are very depleted. And so the policy idea is to look at species on a case-by-case basis and to determine those which would bring environmental and economic benefits and social benefits. And so that process is one that we license in terms of being able to grant permissions to bring animals back. And, you know, in that is a kind of hierarchy of controversy, if you like. At one end of it is the large blue butterfly, which I don't think anyone really objects to. It's been a great success. In the middle maybe is the beaver, when most people think, yeah, on the one hand and on the other, but yeah, generally okay. There's still some residual concerns about that. And then you get to things like the lynx and the white-tailed eagle, where it does become a more polarized discussion. So in those, well, in all cases, but in those cases in particular, you know, the importance of applying the IUCN, so the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, sets a standard for species reintroduction, and that's at the core of the policy that we operate in looking at particular applications. And so this is about, will it work? Will there be welfare issues for the animal? Do we know whether there's enough habitat for it? You know, all these kinds of questions that need to be looked at in some detail before determining to do a release. And also part of those criteria is about what you do if it goes wrong and having a plan to be able to cope with that. And so that policy is at the core of what we do. And we look at the different applications that come in through the prism of those IUCN criteria and against that government policy, which sets out that broad ambition to restore the natural environment. You know, and some of these things that are gone, you know, they are really, really important ecologically beyond what they represent as an individual species. So the beaver's a good example of this. It has a really profound effect on the entire ecosystem in ways that, you know, in some catchments at least, can be quite beneficial in terms of reducing flood risk and improving river water quality. And so you'd look at that and say, actually, that is actually part of nature recovery. In relation to lynx, you know, it's an apex predator, and apex predators, we know, are very, very important components of ecosystems. The question is, you know, can they coexist with other land uses and other activities that are going on in those landscapes? And that's when, you know, when we get an application, we look at it and we try and triangulate through all of those different elements. Ecological value, will it work? What are the existing land uses? Will there be an economic downside? Have we got an exit strategy? And then make a decision. And so we had an application for lynx before my time, back in, I think 18, wasn't it, Geoff? It came in, that one. And, you know, we looked at it and we said, actually, this is not a sufficiently good quality application. And the Secretary of State called that one in. So the Secretary of State can take those and look at them and say, from the point of view of, you know, the minister, to say whether they think it's a good idea or not. And we advised it probably wasn't a good idea. In fact, we advised it wasn't a good idea. He agreed it wasn't a good idea and it got turned down. And the reason it wasn't a good idea was because there wasn't sufficient science to show whether it would work, and there wasn't sufficient consultation with people who would be affected for us to give it the thumbs up. So that one went away. Now we're told, well, I'm told by newspaper articles, no one's actually said this to me personally, I'm told by newspaper articles that there is another application coming. but I don't know anything about it. No one's told me about it. I've not seen it. But when and if it does come, we will look at it and we will put it through that process that we operate. The other thing I should say is that alongside what we're already doing in terms of having that IUCN approach to looking at species on a case-by-case basis, we're just working at the moment with DEFRA on a code for species reintroduction, which will hopefully put a more strategic wrapper around all of this. And so that's in development at the moment with our specialist team. And also, once we've done that, we will be setting up a stakeholder forum to be able to include people in the conversations in a more structured way. So, you know, it might well be that your organisation will want to be a member of that stakeholder forum. Geoff, you might have more details on where we're at with this and what kind of membership it would be. But I would have thought the National Sheep Association would be one of the organisations that we'd expect to be in that stakeholder forum, wouldn't we? And
yep.
To be there, you know, and sharing perspectives as we go forward. So yeah, you're right, Phil. You know, I did express a positive view about this. You know, I'm an ecologist and have been brought up with you know, science and ideas about the importance of ecosystems functioning with all of the components in them, including predators where possible. And so I expressed a view on that. And, you know, I have to say, you know, you're right, it is quite difficult being the chair of a public body and, you know, being asked what is my view. And I think in the interest of transparency, you know, I'm generally, I think it's best to be open about what my views are. You know, equally, you know, if vegans say to me, why aren't you a vegan? I tell them my view and they get angry too. I literally cannot win. But you know, that's part of the piece, of course.
I think people understand that, and they also expect, and I'm sure we've got every confidence in the, you know, the governance and the structures of Natural England not being overly influenced by any one individual, whether it's the chair or any of the members or whatever it might be. So I'm sure that is the case. Let's just talk a little bit about consultations at the moment as well, because going on to white-tailed sea eagles. You know, there's another application coming forward now from the Wildken Hill Estate in North Norfolk to do another release. We actually sit, I hope, in a very constructive manner on the Isle of Wight steering group for the release down there. And I've always been really openly critical about the fact that if we're going to release things like these, you know, these species are fairly mobile. The consultation should be a full, honest and open consultation. And for a consultation to be focused on the Isle of Wight or in the south of England, it really for an Isle of Wight release isn't adequate. Neither is an online consultation and a focus around the landowners in North Norfolk for a release up in North Norfolk. You know, these birds and lynx could, in 50 years' time, 100 years' time, be right across our island with many people never having had the opportunity to have a say or an input, and that brings into question Scotland as well, and any license application in England, so close to the Scottish border. So, you know, our view is that, you know, if these things are going to be consulted, they need to be done independently, widely, and with time for everyone to engage as well. Yeah.
Well, hopefully, Phil, what I described in terms of the new policy follow through with the code and the stakeholder forum, hopefully that will be a means to be able to do some of that.
Yeah, no, well, I welcome that.
Just maybe, Geoff, have you got anything to add on those points about species reintroductions? Maybe I missed something. And
no, I think you've. I mean, just yeah, we're hoping to publish that code this year, and as part of the publication, then there will be the call for the stakeholder management group. So yeah, it's well and truly on the books, and there's a great opportunity for organisations such as yourself, Phil, you know, to represent not only you know, your specific interest, but to represent, you know, a national picture around that as well. So yeah, there's an opportunity there.
I'm just scanning through. We've probably got just over 5 minutes left. I'm scanning through some of the questions that have been coming through, and again, some of these we've talked about. But Georgie Rabin has made the case that trade-offs and unintended consequences could be unwanted results of policy. Again, we've talked about this. I think we've covered this through the stakeholder group that you just described, really. But rewilding or significantly decreasing stocking densities further on the hill creates an inevitable buildup of vegetation and fuel load, extensive wildfires that we're seeing more and more of. You know, again, thinking through, you know, Tony, you talked about your interest as an ecologist in assessing the environmental or the ecological impact of some of these things, but the I suppose the value of a stakeholder group and the involvement of organisations like us is to enable these things to be seen within the widest context and to try and ground truth some of those unintended consequences.
Yes, indeed, and this is the spot we need to arrive at is to combine the science with what goes on in terms of the practical running of a business on the ground, and hopefully that's where Natural England, combining its policy advice with its scientific underpinning, can do some of that. But it is the case in our crowded island that we have many competing interests operating in any landscape, and it's a really tricky thing to do, to be able to get all of those things lined up. The infrastructure companies, the farmers, the water companies, people who want to build houses, people who want to have more rewilding, how we're going to catch carbon, and the people who want to enjoy those areas. And on wildfires, I think what we've seen, and certainly I saw some data last year in the Peak District, that there was a big correlation with people going out and leaving barbecues. And last year, when we had that period of dry weather combined with lockdown and people not being able to go to the football or the cinema, they went to the countryside and they didn't really know what to do, and so there's another big kind of public engagement piece there that links into some of these questions, especially that wildfire one. We had 2 horrendous fires last year on our nature reserves. Looks like both of them were down to barbecues being left behind, and so fuel load, yes, it's an issue, but actually it requires someone to set fire to it, and so what do we do about that as part of the same picture?
Yeah, absolutely.
Bill, I think we sorry, I was just going to comment on the unintended consequences. I think we really do, and as a farmer, I really recognize the challenge of the next 5-7 years as we move through the agricultural transition period. I mean, it's immense and it's confusing and it's a protracted period. And if we look at upland, lowland grazing livestock farms, where classically something like 90% of their farm business income comes combined from BPS and agri-environment, then the shift of the monies within that, and indeed the shift of the margins within that, is considerable. And we like to plan on a long-term basis, and it's going to be a challenge. And I saw a comment flash on the screen earlier: no pressure on us farmers. Clearly, there's going to be immense pressure on us farmers in terms of how we manage that. And I do, worry about some of the unintended consequences. I think there's going to be vast, some very interesting dynamics around land rentals, around FBTs, around landlord-tenant relationships as we shift forward in this funding. Yeah. I think the one thing, the slightly brighter note I would end on is AHDB did some great analysis in the early days of this shift, and the one common message which came out, irrespective of what sector you are in, providing you're up there in the top 25% in terms of optimizing your production, not maximizing, but optimizing your production, you can weather the storms. So the clearly is a real need for that continued focus on optimizing productivity, so that you will be in a position to embrace some of these new opportunities.
Great, thanks, Geoff. Yeah. Just finally, too, we ought to think about drawing this to a close, really, and we could go on for a long time, I know that. But again, really for you, Tony, a general question about that balance between food production and feeding ourselves, I guess, healthily and in a good, sustainable way, and the delivery of environmental issues, and that issue, the risk of offshoring environmental problems as well. You talk quite passionately early on about food and the importance of food and supply chains. Do you think that overall a reduction in food production here in the UK is inevitable, or are there other ways of seeking productivity and getting that balance better?
No, I don't think inevitably we have a reduction in food production here. It might change somewhat. So, for example, could we be doing more with horticulture and maybe focus less on cereals? And, quite a lot of our cereals are being fed to animals in factory farms. Might we get more value out of our land for public health and food security if we had more extensive livestock production and more vegetables? So those kinds of questions, they're huge, big ones. but they come across the agenda every now and again when you ask that question about productivity and what we can feed ourselves with. And maybe we need to be taking a slightly different view of what we could be good at in the future. More fruits and vegetables, and maybe fewer grains, for instance, and something in there. Evidently big opportunities coming from technology, and the ways in which we might be able to get more through a combination of GPS and digital technologies, and how we use those to be boosting production in a sustainable way. So there's lots of things that are kind of in the mix, but I wouldn't say that going down the sustainability route inevitably means that we need to be reducing the quantity or the proportion of food that we're feeding ourselves with from domestic sources. And it's not only the land, of course, there's the sea. We still get a significant amount of seafood. If we manage the oceans better, we could be getting more out of that at the same time as improving marine biodiversity. And then when it comes to agriculture on land, it's not only food that the demands are there for. There's an energy element. That's another complexity, of course, in terms of bioenergy crops. The other thing actually is fibre, which of course really does relate to your businesses, and the extent to which wool is a fantastically renewable resource that we should be making much more of. I was listening to a piece the other day on the radio about microplastics building up in the sea from polyester fragments coming off of people's clothes, going down their washing machines and into sewage works, and then polluting plankton that's going up the food chain in the marine environment at the same time as we can't sell wool. I mean, that is literally madness.
Well, Tony, you'll be absolutely delighted to hear that someone sent me a sample pack last week of tree shelters. There's the Tubex tree shelters that we see littered across the countryside, and these are made out of wool fibre.
Oh, fantastic!
And cashew nut resin. And
cool. We should have a chat with the Forestry Commission about that. Absolutely.
Well, they're going to be on the market as from later this year, I think. And, they're not overly expensive.
Okay. Do send us details on that, Phil. That needs to be shared. That's I think, a very visible sign of not very good practice, is leaving all those plastic tubes.
Absolutely. Thomas.
If I could just wade in there. Sorry, I know we don't want to get down to specifics, but tree planting is quite a big issue, especially in the hills. Could I fire a couple of questions quickly to Tony? A, where do you see the vast majority of all these trees going? And B, following on from the the mass littering exercises that occur when these plantations fail, is there room to broaden the thinking behind tree planting to perhaps include some spruce trees to help nurse the small hardwood trees up, particularly when they've been grown on grade 1 or 2 arable ground and then taken into the uplands into a wet acidic soil? You've got carbon storage plus points, flood mitigation plus points, and you mentioned biofuel as well. Where does all that fit into your thinking?
Yeah, so the work we've been doing at Natural England around the England tree strategy, we've been trying to pull in some of these thoughts, because what's happened is it's a very simple thing, planting a tree, and it sounds great, and therefore everybody gets behind it, and there's all sorts of initiatives now from the government, from NGOs, from companies. They're going to plant millions of trees, and it's going to be a great environmental breakthrough, but the complexity behind that, of course, is enormous, because what's happened lately is that trees have become carbon. The carbon kind of obsession has gone into the tree planting world, and one of the things we have to make sure that we do is not just plant trees for carbon. It's very important we do that, but we need them to improve wildlife habitat, to improve the beauty of landscapes, to reduce flood risk, to clean up rivers, to provide a timber and paper supply, to clean the air, and to provide for public recreation. And so if you put all of those things on top of each other and create a map, I think you'd finish up with a much more informed view of what we need to be doing with our tree planting ambitions. Right tree in the right place for the right reason. That is obviously horrendously complicated, but it's something we have to try and do, rather than just putting in billions of trees in plastic tubes across hillsides and square blocks, which is what we did in the 60s, 70s and 80s, and to move into that much more joined up approach. And the tree strategy will be published, I don't know when it's coming, maybe about April, and hopefully we'll see some of that in there. And the other big thing to be said about trees is you know, the benefits that come with natural regeneration rather than planting, and being able to get woodlands to come back through, you know, natural seed sources. And that doesn't work everywhere. Some planting is needed. I mean, there's a spectrum from pure planting to pure natural regeneration, with a spectrum in the middle, which, you know, includes supplementary planting, including maybe spruce as a nurse crop to get the deciduous trees up, which then becomes a timber crop as well. So there's an awful lot of complexity in there, Thomas, and I just hope that, you know, as we go forward, we can start to get our arms around some of that. It probably comes down to mapping and working out, you know, what the right things are to do in the right geography, how to do it, a bit of fencing in some places, planting in others, you know, and that has to be blended into the overall mix of all these other tools we've got, including elm, of course, and, you know, for that not to be going off in a different direction.
And as you said at the start as well, not ignore the fact that grassland itself performs a really valuable role in terms of carbon storage.
Absolutely.
Thomas, sorry.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, I'm just going to continue on that point, really, you know, because when, you know, I think farmers are painted as anti-tree. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think the right trees in the right place are really helpful, both for nature and for farmers in terms of shelter, etc. And, you know, when you drive around the countryside and see a failed plantation with lots of plastic tubes knocking about, doesn't matter whether you're a farmer or an environmental campaigner or whether you work for Natural England, it's not what we want to see. And I think that's really comforting to hear your points that you've made there, that we're all kind of thinking the same thing, really, and that you know, if we are going to plant, set aside large amounts of area and plant trees by the billion, you know, there really do need to be the right trees in the right place. And that's how you'll get farmers on board with planting trees, is if they can see a direct benefit for themselves, I think. It's good to hear that.
Good, thank you. Well, that's the ambition. Let's hope we can make some progress, as I say, in the context of elm as well, and making sure those two things are two sides of the same coin, really.
Great. Thanks. Dan, did you just have a final point to make before we close?
A bit of a summary in my own mind, really, but I was just going to say that we know as farmers that we can sell diversity, particular breeds, to locals, and there's a market for that people will pay for. It doesn't feed the masses, but we know with lamb we've got a large demand at the moment. The government's looking to open more markets, so we're really conscious, or I'm particularly conscious of the fact that we've got to try our best to work together and get something that will work and meet these balances. Because what we don't want is, like you mentioned, Tony, with steel and coal, because with livestock and meat, we have such different welfare standards that we work under, and we'd hate to be undermined by farmers that of lower standard products coming into the country. And in my mind, on the releases, we just don't want to, in 20 years' time, be the people that are faced with the problems. And there are all sorts of issues, like we saw with the lynx being or escaping from a zoo in Devon, that then became a problem to the area, and the police got involved to deal with it. And these are all things in 30 years' time, 40 years' time, we don't want to be the ones left with the issue. We want to work as closely as we can to try and make sure these aren't problems for the future. Thank you.
Very good, Dan. Thank you.
Great. Okay, look, we've overrun. I said I wouldn't do that, but we have. And as I say, this could have gone for hours. I'd like to apologise to the many people who have posted comments and questions that I may not have read them out specifically, but they have influenced the discussion. I've been keeping an eye on them as we've been going through. So I hope lots of the topics have been touched on, if not fully covered. You know, Geoff very gratefully or graciously offered to look at some of these questions afterwards as well. So we'll continue that dialogue afterwards. And yeah, I'd just like to extend a huge thank you to you, Tony, and to Geoff, well, and to Dan and Thomas for joining us as well, but in particular to you, Tony and Geoff, for joining us this morning. It's been a very open and honest discussion, really valuable, I think, and hopefully will help to create that framework for an increasingly strong connection between us in the future. So I look forward to that. I
do hope so, Phil. Thanks ever so much. Really great to be here, and hopefully of interest to hear from us.
Yeah, thanks for the invite, Phil.
Thank you very much. Okay, thanks very much, everyone, and goodbye.
See you then.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, everybody.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.